What happens when a revolutionary movement overthrows a Western-backed monarch and then takes control of the world's most vital waterway, going to war with an empire? I'm not talking about Iran or the Strait of Hormuz, but about Egypt and the Suez Crisis. Because that's exactly what Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser did in 1956, when he nationalized the Suez Canal, prying it out of British and French hands. He was called Hitler on the Nile in British papers, as a plot with France and Israel was hatched to invade Egypt and destroy Nasser's attempts at independence. The Suez Canal remained shut as Egypt took on the three armies alone. The global economy reeled. And by 1957, when the canal reopened, now with Egypt in control, the region and the global economy would change forever.
The closure of the Suez Canal proved that if you could blockade a major route of trade, you could change the course of history.
I'm Mohamed Hassan, and this is Deja Vu. My guest today is Dr. Laleh Khalili, professor of Gulf Studies at the University of Exeter. She is the author of a number of books on everything from Middle East politics to seafaring. In 2020, she published Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula. Laleh Khalili, welcome to Deja Vu.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
Now, before we start, I need to get something off my chest because I found out that you used to be an engineer.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
All the parents in the Middle East or, global South have fantasies of their children becoming doctors or engineers.
Mm-hmm.
So when I decided to go to university, I thought, I wanted to become an engineer first and then a doctor, but ended up not doing that either. So So I've had a kind of a circuitous route to getting a PhD in political science.
I only bring it up because I'm also used to be an engineer.
For your sins.
Yes,
What
exactly.
kind of engineer are you?
I used to be a civil engineer. So, I was also somebody that really never found myself in engineering. I hated it, in fact. And the moment that I was able to leave and do journalism, I leapt at the opportunity. But the one thing that has stayed with me over the course of time is I have this weird fascination that I don't like admitting to myself to understanding systems.
Yes.
And understanding
Absolutely.
flow, whether it's human flow or in this instance, maritime flow and trade. And the last couple of years have been so disruptive in our lives, whether it's COVID, when you wrote your book Sinews, or whether it is the current crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, we're suddenly becoming aware of how the world actually works.
Yeah.
When did you stop paying attention to that?
So I started paying attention to that quite a long time ago. One of the central puzzles that actually made me very curious about it was that if you are aware, Jebel Ali port in Dubai is usually in the top 10 largest container ports in the world. All of the other ports that preceded on that list are either in East Asia or Southeast Asia. Usually Singapore or Shanghai are number one and number two. And then there's Jebel Ali. And Jebel Ali is an actually larger port than, say, Antwerp or Rotterdam, both of which are enormous. And so the central puzzle that has animated my work since then has been, what is it that drives a small city-state like Dubai, which doesn't have an immediate large hinterland like Rotterdam does, for example, get to be such a large port. And so what is it about logistics and its organization in the world that creates such weird geographies? But then, as you mentioned, 2020 was not only the year of COVID lockdown, where hundreds of thousands of seafarers ended up being stuck on board ships because all of the ports shut down and they wouldn't let people off. And also, even if they could get off at the port, they couldn't fly home because all of the airlines had also ceased really carrying people. And so you had all these seafarers that were abandoned at sea, some for up to 2 years, which is kind of a horrific thing if you think about. But also the little green ship got stuck in the Suez Canal.
Yes, the Evergreen.
Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal. And of course, it generated millions of memes.
My favorite one is the one of the tiny Egyptian
the little digger
that was attempting
that
to...
could.
unblock the global food chain.
You gotta love it, right?
Yeah.
With the driver who had his ships on, and he was just trying to get the
Incredibly stressed out. There's so much at stake.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, the fact that one ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, and that really threw the whole flow of global trade, and particularly the trade between Asia and Europe. It became very clear that this system was stretched taut, and that tautness, which is often touted as being efficiency, is actually also a major weakness of the system. That was one thing. The other, so this is the question of flows. You also mentioned systems. Infrastructures are also, of course, necessary to this logistical flow. And the year before, we had a more horrendous event actually happening, which was the major explosion at the port of Beirut. Hundreds of people were killed, and it destroyed many, many neighborhoods surrounding the port. And it really shed a light on how the systems there weren't working. Because, of course, nobody had really, since the Civil War, thought about how significant the port was to the everyday life of the Beirut commerce, but also to the life of Lebanon.
Yeah.
So since then, we've basically, people are much more attentive to what happens in the world around them, whether it's a question of catastrophe in ports or blockages of flows.
This is the thing that struck me when reading your writing is when I think about global trade, and especially global maritime trade, the impression that I have, or that I had, was that it was this well-oiled machine where everybody's following the rules, everything is going so well, and whenever these disruptions happen, these are aberrations. The Strait of Hormuz is blocked. Why would anybody want to disrupt this perfect synergy of global connection that goes on? And of course, the way that you write about it, it presents a very different side of it, a much shadier, darker side, where there's a lot of things that are happening that we don't know about. There's huge workers' rights issues that take place on the sea, whether it's the slavery that takes place on some of these shipping vessels. What do you think ultimately people misunderstand about the way that our global trade actually works?
Number one, that there are about 2 million seafarers working on ships all around the world. And that the number of seafarers that actually work on some of the largest ships is surprisingly small. Some of these largest ships, the number of people that work on them is between 20 and 30 people. So you have a ship that is as long as the Empire State Building is tall. If you laid down the Empire State Building on its side, it would be about the same length as some of the larger container ships or bulk ships or tankers. And yet, on this massive ship, only 30 people work on it. Of those 30, maybe about 10, 12 work down in the engine room. And what is extraordinary about that is that these are folks that are dealing with some of the largest and most complex engines anywhere. And yet when the machine breaks down at sea, they're basically fixing stuff with the stuff that you would have in your toolbox, maybe a little bit more sophisticated, but it's crazy how incredibly skilled they are. And then on the deck, you have the seafarers that are going around maintaining the ship's cargo. So it's like a never-ending work. So this is the second thing that is fascinating about shipping, is how the ordinary functioning of today's maritime trade depends on something called open registries. Open registries are where you register your ship to a country that has perhaps no relationship at all to the ownership of the ship, or to where it operates from and to, or to the people that operate the ship, or even to the cargo that is transporting. So the world's biggest open registries are Panama, Liberia, Mongolia has an open registry. Mongolia is landlocked. So these are basically money-making ventures. And in the case of the top 4 or 5 major open registries, they are basically former colonies, either of Britain or informally of the United States, that often have very small economies and therefore are looking for some way to make money.
So these ships are basically flying the flags of Panama or Mongolia
or
and paying,
Liberia or Marshall Islands or Panama or Bahamas.
even if they have nothing to do with.
They have nothing to do with it.
They're not clearly taking their ships to Mongolia.
No, they're
can't.
not. Definitely not. Or they're not probably even going to Panama. What is the, well, maybe they are going to Panama. And so labor, environmental provisions, operational sort of safety, questions of insurance are much laxer in these open registries.
Right.
So the vast majority, about 60% of the world's ships are under open registries. And then if you ever actually pay attention to mistakes that happen, spillages that happen when ships run aground, when you have explosions happening, when you have terrible stuff that happens, and certainly when there are seafarers abandoned at sea with no wages paid for 4 years and no food or electricity on board the ship, reliant on the goodness of charities, almost always they're flying flags of convenience. So there was a Syrian guy that had been abandoned on a ship in the Gulf of Suez, very close to Suez itself, to the port of Suez, and he couldn't leave. And the Egyptian government, for example, wouldn't allow him to leave because somebody needed to stay on the ship to be responsible for the ship. And so the ship was within sight of land, but the guy could not get onto the land. He had to swim every couple of days to charge his mobile phone and pick up some food, and then swim back. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that happens. So it's, flags of convenience is one of those biggest sort of open secrets that people don't talk about.
And is that a way that countries also use to try and bypass sanctions by flying other flags?
Definitely. So that actually has been something that has happened for hundreds of years. Usually, during the imperial era, if a ship flew the flag of a country, say if a Omani ship flew the flag of Britain, it basically put itself under the protection of the British. At the time, in the 19th century, early 20th century, the flag wasn't just something that you did to evade powers. It was a way to actually put yourself under the protection of a power. And now what you're finding is that you're finding not only people physically flying a different flag in order to evade protection, but also spoofing their digital ID, which every ship nowadays is supposed to have, so that it indicates that it's some other kind of ship, and not what you think it is.
Wow. We're going to get to that, I think, when we talk about the Hormuz eventually. But speaking of the British and the French empires that set up these huge maritime trading laws and routes that are still used today, the Suez Canal was this joint project between the French and the British.
Indeed.
And this was a route that had always been used as a way to bring and transport goods between Europe and Asia and Europe and Africa. And then at some point, under the occupation of Egypt, they decide that they're going to dig this permanent trench and turn it into a canal.
They actually used the canal to occupy Egypt. So the Khedive of Egypt was quite happy to allow for the canal to be dug, and to collaborate with the French in its construction. And the collaboration, of course, was quite bloody because a lot of Egyptian fellahin peasants were forced into digging the canal for no pay. So basically it was slave labor, basically. But then the British and the French used the debts that the Khedive had accumulated as an excuse to come in. Well, the British came and occupied.
So they lent him money.
Debt, diplomacy.
To pay them to build this canal that ultimately
benefited them.
Right. That's a story that has never been repeated in any other scenario.
Yeah, I mean, this is basically it's one of the most famous instances of debt diplomacy, which is the British and the French lent the Khedive money. The Khedive used the money that they had lent to build the canal, which was going to benefit the British and the French. And then the British and the French called in their debts, and when the Khedive couldn't pay, the British occupied Egypt basically for the next however many 82 to 52. for the next 70 years.
And then in 1952, there's a revolution in Egypt. Military leaders take over. They brand themselves as being anti-imperialist. At the head of this movement of the free soldiers
It's
is
Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Exactly. And he really brands himself as not only the champion of Egyptian sovereignty, but the champion of sovereignty across the third world at the time.
Yeah. I mean, he was an interesting figure. And like all of the post-colonial figures, there are major contradictions in who he was and what he did. He instituted, for example, land reforms that were enormously significant for Egyptian fellahin. And I think that partially explains also the huge and enormous love that people had for him, which is basically never been repeated for any of the people that followed him. He also spoke to the oppressed in Africa. He spoke to the oppressed in the Arab world. When Patrice Lumumba was killed by the Belgians and the Americans, his children, Nasser smuggled his children out of Congo and basically took them and raised them. So he was this incredible figure. And I think on top of that, he was attractive, he was charismatic, he was really tall, he was really funny. And I think all of those things made him really quite kind of a figure. Although he was also incredibly repressive internally. Both communists and Islamists languished in his prisons. And so he was a complex figure and perhaps for that reason very fascinating. But one of the things that he did, which was pretty extraordinary, was that in 1956, he decided to nationalize the Suez Canal. This had happened in the wake of when Mohamed Hassan, Iran's democratically elected prime minister, had decided to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which later became BP. And of course, a coup happens within a year after that nationalization, and Mossadegh is overthrown, and the Shah, the king, is reinstalled. Basically, the oil, the Iranian national oil, is then operated by a consortium of Americans and British. But the Mossadegh moment had been incredibly inspiring across the Middle East. And it's funny to go through magazines in Egyptian Arabic language magazines from the 1950s, because you do find that Mossadegh was actually held as a kind of a hero. But I also think that Nasser realized that the British and French sovereignty over Suez gave them an inordinate amount of strategic and commercial power. And so he decided to nationalize it. Of course, we know what happens immediately afterwards. Israel, the British and the French decide to march across Sinai and to take Suez. Israel had
the question that I always have is why does Israel get involved?
So Israel has a double stake in the Suez Canal from two different directions. One is that Israel. One of the things that Nasser had talked about for quite a long time was to blockade the Strait of Tiran at the entrance to the Gulf of Aqaba. At the top of the Gulf of Aqaba sits the port of Eilat, right next to the Aqaba in Jordan. Brand new port, and it gave Israel a strategic beachhead at the top of Gulf of Aqaba, which was at the top of the Red Sea. So that was one interest. But
just before you get to the Suez Canal.
Just before you get to the Suez Canal. So that was one reason. The second reason, and people always forget this, is that Sinai had oil. And the Israelis really, really coveted that oil. And in fact, that was one of the reasons that when after the 1967 war, they occupied Sinai, they wanted to stay there for forever. So those were the two reasons. And these had to do directly with Sinai and with the Suez Canal. But there was another reason, and that is that we also forget that Israel basically has, from its inception, been a settler colony with a mother country in either Europe or North America. That everybody claims that it is different than, say, Algeria, which has a mother country in France, but really it has had. I mean, the British basically sponsored the formation of Israel in the 1950s. The French supported Israel by giving it nuclear weaponry. And of course, after 1967, the US basically became Israel's sugar daddy. So This was unsurprising, and the historian Avi Shleim, who has looked at the archival material, has written a lot about the conversations that went on between the Guy Mollet of France, Anthony Eden of Britain, and David Ben Gurion of Israel about what they could do once they took over Suez. And the Israelis did keep saying to the French in this instance, you really should let us keep Sinai. You really should let us keep Sinai. And of course, the Suez then would have been the natural line. And if like the British and the French controlled that, then that would have been the border for Israel as it wanted, the greater Israel fantasy that they had. And of course, we know that this happened exactly at the same time as the Soviet Union had invaded Hungary in 1956, and Eisenhower could not afford the Soviets to be able to say, well, look at the British, they've just invaded Sinai. So Eisenhower put his foot down and forced the tripartite powers to withdraw from the Suez Canal. But what that particular event showed between the moment of invasion and March of 1958. And those months were transformative for the world. It resulted in the construction of the first supertankers, because if ships weren't going to be able to go through the Suez Canal, they were going to have to go around the Cape of Good Hope. So both the oil companies and the various other kinds of manufacturers were thinking, well, we need to have bigger ships, because if they're going to have to, if their route is going to be 2-3 weeks longer, might as well have the economies of scale. Huge events happened here because of the closure of the Suez Canal and energy not reaching Britain. There was massive shortages of both energy factories shut down. There was a shortage of tea. And actually, one of the longer term effects of the 1956 closure was that there was a huge wave of migration of Brits to Australia and New Zealand because of the shutdown in factories. And of course, also acceleration of exploration for oil in places that didn't lie in that direction. So Libya and Nigeria. So the closure of the Suez Canal proved that if you could blockade a major route of trade, you could change the course of history.
The Suez Crisis often gets talked about as sort of the nail in the coffin of the British Empire.
Yes.
That this was a major turning point in the way that British power was perceived in the world.
Indeed.
What happens to Britain in this? Ultimately, it's a humiliation. You know, that they're forced to drag their feet back at the behest of the Americans.
So if you look at every empire as operating on the basis of a given form of energy and dominating a particular set of financial weaponry, the globe operated really by the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century on factory production based on coal and on the sterling. But the Second World War and the US domination of oil production in the world changes that calculus. And what the Suez Canal does is it accelerates that downfall of the sterling. So where oil discovery, particularly with the US and Saudi Arabia, and then, of course, the takeover of the consortium in Iran, it ends up becoming quite a significant transformative moment energy-wise. And then the change in financial channels from sterling to the dollar ends up becoming quite significant as well. And these two events, which are about political economy, underline the significance of the strategic defeats as well. So the British were humiliated by the US, but it took, between 58 and 71 for their protectorates in the Gulf, for example, to be freed. And so the sovereignty for them, or the protection for them, being handed from the British to the US. It also certainly spelled the same for the French. Algeria, which had been settled and occupied by France, becomes independent as a result also of that Suez catastrophe. Catastrophe for them, victory for Nasser, and also for the Third World.
And then it also creates the myth of Nasser himself.
Indeed.
Because then here is this young anti-imperialist who takes on three of the world's great powers at the time, and including Israel regionally, and ultimately they are forced to stand down for whatever reason, and Egypt retains control over the Suez Canal.
Exactly. It does. And so everything that happens thereafter, and particularly in the 1967 war, is really targeted at that. So maritime access has always been this incredibly significant and important and sensitive matter of conflict in the region.
And not only that, he's also fueling and funding a civil war that's happening in Yemen. And part of this, from my understanding, is also about who gets to control the port of Aden, right?
It does indeed. So if we want to draw a sketch of this moment, the country that we recognize as Yemen in that moment was actually divided into, I would say, 3 different administrative forms. One was Northern Yemen, which was governed by a Zaydi imam. Then there was the port of Aden, which in 1958 was still a British colony, a direct colony. So one of the only real colonies that the British had in the Middle East with that name. And then the rest of what we now consider to be southern Yemen were British protectorates. What we had going on in 1958 was a series of revolts, both in what became South Yemen and what was in North Yemen. In South Yemen, these were also Nasserist officers who rose against the Imam and tried to turn the country into a kind of a bastion of Nasserist Pan-Arabism. Of course, this was considered to be a major affront to the British, and the British decided to come in support of the Zaydi Imam. But because they had their hands full with the insurgency in the south, and also they didn't want to be seen to be directly involved, they got the Saudis involved and the Israelis also, because the Israelis were thinking, hey, this is one good place that we can go against Nasser in Yemen. And so the Israelis were flying British jets, delivering goods paid for by the Saudis to the Zaydi Imam in Yemen. And Nasser was, of course, supporting the Nasserist officers on the other side. So you had this really interesting secret alliance between the British, the Israelis, and the Saudis happening behind the scenes. So you had this incredible moment happening in there. And part of the reason that the Yemen was considered to be really such a significant site was not only because of its proximity to Aden, but also because of the port of Hodeidah itself, which is actually on the other side of the peninsula from right around the corner from Aden, but also quite significant in terms of its access to Bab al-Mandab.
Which is another one of those names that everybody's now become familiar with.
Because of
the Houthis.
Because of the Houthis, or the Ansar Allah, which are a group of Zaydis, therefore descendants of the supporters of the Yazidi Imam. It's a kind of an interesting dance that happens. Yeah. What's interesting about both Bab al-Mandab and Hormuz, and I think this is also something that will come up, is that they have both been recognized as being really incredibly significant strategic points, not just for the last 100 years, not just for the last 200 years, but for the last 500 years. There's a really fascinating letter from a Portuguese explorer by the name of Afonso de Albuquerque, who came out to the Western Indian Ocean to basically plant the Portuguese flag in all of these places. And he has this letter written in 1511 in which he talks about how the 3 most important and strategic points in the Western Indian Ocean are the Strait of Malacca near Singapore, still one of the largest commercial straits in the world. 30% of the world's goods and 20% of the world's oil goes through the Strait of Malacca. Second, Bab al-Mandab at the entrance to the Red Sea. And third, he says Hormuz, which he says that is the one that is the most significant because it's also sitting close to Mesopotamia and to Iran. And he says in this letter written in 1511, he says, if anybody controls these 3 strategic points, they will control the world.
One of the things that you write about in this book is about how every military confrontation that takes place around these 3 areas not only changes the way the world thinks about trade and the way that the geopolitics of the countries operate, but also changes the dynamic of power in the region itself.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about the 1967 war, which again closes the Suez Canal, and then the Lebanon civil war and the involvement of Israel, and then the Iran-Iraq war and the tanker wars that take place in the Gulf. What is happening in the peninsula, in the Arab Peninsula, during this time as a result of all of these different fractures?
So there are multiple dynamics at play from the 1960s onwards, which are quite significant in the transformation of the Arabian Peninsula, and therefore the two major straits that lie to the north and to the south of the peninsula, Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb. The first and most significant local set of dynamics are the dynamics around nationalization of oil. There's huge amounts of negotiations, threats and counter threats, bluffs and counter bluffs that are going on, really starting from the 1960s, in an attempt by the countries which actually held the reserves of oil against what was then called the Seven Sisters. So 5 US-based and 2 British oil companies, to extract better deals out of them. Some of the more striking statistics that come out is that in 1958 were basically held by the British and the Americans. About 60% of the world's oil reserves, international oil reserves, not the ones in the US, were held by the US, 18% by British Petroleum and Shell. And then what remained, which is about 20%, was the residual that was held, say, in Russia or Mexico, that were not necessarily run by these places. By 1960s, the deals on these had begun to shift. And so there was a huge amount of pressure by a number of different countries that actually lay along the spectrum from quite radical to quite reformist, to extract a better deal out of the Seven Sisters. So this dynamic was really significant, because if these countries nationalized their oil, that would also mean that they would gain control over the downstream forms of production. And circulation of oil, so petrochemicals, shipping, etc.
I learned about this recently because my father-in-law used to work in oil. So upstream is like extraction, getting all of the oil and gas in the ground. Downstream is turning it into things that then we can use.
That's right. Yeah. So anything that happens after you pull the oil out of the ground is downstream. And what the Seven Sisters used to have was what was called vertical integration, which means that the upstream and downstream, all of the different functions were the same company. It basically ran all of them. And one of the things that starts happening in the 1960s is the unraveling of that vertical integration, even before the oil is nationalized. So what you end up seeing is that the Kuwaitis, for example, end up setting up their own shipping company in order to ship some of the oil. Because, of course, Kuwait had also gone independent in 1961, ahead of the other Emirates on the Gulf. That was a local dynamic. There was also a regional dynamic. And the regional dynamic was that the multiple wars that were happening was resulting in major shifts of let's say subsidiary or auxiliary kinds of services that oil production and the economy needed in the Arabian Peninsula, but which were not located there. So all the big construction companies that, for example, were involved in building infrastructures or pipelines or whatever in Arabian Peninsula, their headquarters was in Beirut. The big banks that did a lot of the petrodollars flowed through or was used to pay commercial ventures near and far were headquartered in Beirut. And in addition to that, as you can imagine, summers in the Arabian Peninsula were hot. So usually people that worked in the oil industry or any of the other commercial industries there would summer in Beirut. So you would have the big sort of massive migration of folks westward to the Mediterranean. And then on top of that was the famous British spy school in Chemelin, which was a British language school. And all of these Aramco and other kinds of employees would actually go to this language school to learn Arabic. So there was Beirut was this incredibly important hub for oil, even though Lebanon itself was not an oil producer. Loads of memoirs from that era talk about, the journalists that are write about how they picked up their best scoops about what was happening in Aramco in the bar at the St. George Hotel in Beirut, because that's where everybody gathered. So Beirut was really important until, of course, the 67 war, and then much more significantly, the Lebanese Civil War, which started in the mid-1970s. And when the Lebanese Civil War really kicked into gear in 75, a lot of these banks and commercial ventures located what they thought temporarily, relocated to Kuwait, to Bahrain, and eventually to Dubai. That also partially explains why Bahrain, just as it was about ready to run out of oil, actually ended up developing such a significant commercial banking sector. And then as the war went on, and then, of course, the Lebanese Civil War lasted basically from 75 until 1990, 1991, really a lot of businesses shifted eastward to the Emirates. So you had oil being nationalized, and you had, therefore, money being actually now spent on infrastructures and everything in these countries in the Gulf. And you had these businesses shifting there. And then when Iran and Iraq went to war against each other, that was really quite important, because both of them actually had allies, or if not allies, at least middlemen across the Gulf. The Iraqis in Kuwait, ironically, the Iranians in Dubai. And Dubai and Kuwait ended up becoming, in some ways, headquarters for a lot of the businesses that ran out of Iran and Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war.
Right. And again, that includes a lot of international companies that were essentially financing and fueling the war.
A lot of actually local companies that needed foreign currencies, and so they could get that by setting up their bank account in Kuwait City or in Dubai. There was a lot of that sort of infrastructure of gray zone, like not quite licit, but not quite illicit relations for countries that were ostensibly not supposed to be able to spend or acquire dollars, that were able to do so by setting up shop, Iranian or Iraqi companies. And then, of course, you also had the international companies that wanted to trade with Iran or wanted to trade with Iraq, and so they set up shop in Kuwait and Dubai.
And was there a sense for the West, for the United States and the French and the British and these and the oil companies that are associated with these countries? Was there a sense that there would be more geopolitical stability in the Gulf states that they were losing in some of these other places that were being embroiled in war?
I mean, I think at that moment it probably did feel that the peninsula was much more stable, in part because from starting in the early 1980s, the United States really started setting up bases also in the Gulf Basin. Already in 1971, when the British had withdrawn, that basically handed the keys to all of their bases to the US. So in Bahrain, for example, their big naval base, the big British naval base, ends up becoming sort of the home of the Fifth Fleet. Eventually, the U.S. sets up a major CENTCOM headquarters in the 1990s in Al Udeid in Qatar. It's CENTCOM's Air Force sets up bases in various other places. They're both secret and open U.S. Army bases across Saudi Arabia, which, of course, the bombing of the Al Khobar Towers really does kind of put an end to. So there was the U.S. was also concentrating its bases in the region, and that made, I think, a lot of commercial ventures feel that would be more stable, because the U.S. would provide this umbrella of protection through its presence with its bases. But it was also, I think, it was also that these countries were not involved in war, right? Which, of course, with Kuwait, it changed in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait, precisely because Kuwait had held so much of the debt that Iraq owed because of the Iran-Iraq war to Kuwait. And so they thought that the way that they could wipe the debt was to come and invade Kuwait. And that resulted actually, again, in another set of movements of companies from Kuwait eastward toward Dubai. And through all of this, Dubai tried to play a kind of a middleman game, remaining as neutral as possible, which they were fairly successfully able to do until, I would say, about 10, 15 years ago, in the sense that regardless of what the other emirates in the federation would do, and specifically Abu Dhabi, Dubai could do business with everybody. It sort of prided itself as being a kind of a commercial port city, and commercial port cities tend to be open for business to everybody. But as I said, it did have to sort of walk a tightrope because it also financially was financially and for its military protection really dependent on Abu Dhabi, and Abu Dhabi, starting really in the 2010s, became a very belligerent sort of regional power with aspirations beyond its immediate periphery.
You mentioned before the Al Khobar bombings that took place in the mid-90s in Saudi, and that was interesting because it also sets up this fear in some circles of the United States about an inevitable war with Iran, because many people felt that Iran was, including Saudi Arabia, blamed Iran for orchestrating this attack on, U.S. targets, but really they felt it was an attack on Saudi sovereignty. And there is even, I think, Bill Clinton at the time had plans drawn up for an invasion of Iran and this huge military confrontation. Why doesn't this happen? Why at that moment when there is the Iran-Iraq war is over, it's been, in the aftermath of this failure by the West to ultimately topple the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which they tried to do through Saddam Hussein and others, there's this moment where they are going to confront Iran head on. Why doesn't that confrontation happen?
So I think it's actually maybe good to step back to the late 1980s and do talk about the Iran-Iraq war, because I think in some ways everything that is happening in the US-Israeli war on Iran today has echoes that go back, for talking deja vu, there are deja vus that go back to the Iran-Iraq war. Okay, so we know that in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, the Iraqis thought that Iran was a weekend country because, of course, revolutionary countries tend to be fragmented and fractured. And they decided to invade Iran in Khuzestan, Iran's oil-bearing province, and basically marched all the way to the city of Khorramshahr, which sits on Shatt al-Arab, and then tried to march to Abadan, which at one time had the world's largest refinery. It's still Iran's largest refinery. Now, the reason that Saddam Hussein put forward for doing this was basically Iran had the whole control of the Shatt al-Arab. And that was one of the things that Saddam Hussein cited for wanting to invade Iran. Of course, the other reasons were because Saddam Hussein was itching to be the next big strong man in the region, etc. But,
grand ambitions.
Majorly grand ambitions. Anyway, so the Iraqis marched to Khorramshahr, and they thought that the moment that there's a war happening, that this affected people in Iran who were undergoing massive repression by the nascent Islamic Republic. There was huge amounts of executions going on, imprisonments, including of people like my parents, who were lefties. And they expected the Iranian regime to be toppled. But what they hadn't quite calculated was that I think there's a nationalist vein in every country, but particularly in Iran, where when there's an external attack, people rallied around the flag. And with enormous mobilization and huge amounts of sacrifice, people were the Iranian military, but also the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij, which was a kind of an informal militia organization, usually quite youthful folks, managed to push over the course of the next 2 to 4 years, managed to push Iraq back towards Shatt al-Arab, and in fact, in some places across the Shatt al-Arab. So by 1984, we'd arrived at this incredible war of attrition, stalemate on the border. It was absolutely horrendous. People were dying all the time. There's an area called Shalamche in Iran. Most veterans consider it sacred ground because of the amount of blood that was shed there. It was basically trench warfare in the most horrific and horrendous sorts of ways. And the Iraqis felt that they needed to change the calculus. So they went to the French, and the French were like, okay, here's some Exocet missiles and some Super-Étendard jets, and you can go and pound the crap out of Iranians. And what the Iraqis did with that, of course, what was called the War of the Cities, which was the two countries bombing each other's cities, spiked up. But also, the Iraqis took those Super-Étendards and Exocet missiles and started bombing Kharg Island, which was Iran's major oil terminal.
Which we've now also heard a lot about.
Which we've also heard a lot about. And Larak and Lavan. And Lavan was also bombed by the United Arab Emirates not too long ago. So these were all Iran's oil terminals in various locations. And they started also bombing ships that were lifting oil from Iran. Lloyd's of London, here in London, which is an insurance broker, basically an insurance market, immediately raised what is called the war risk premium. The war risk premium is an additional top-up that you add to people's insurance fees in order to insure them against war, violence, or destruction, or whatever. So the insurance rose to incredible amounts, to the point that it was really actually very expensive for any ships to come and lift oil from Iran. So Iranians wanted to even out that kind of sudden loss of balance. And they started bombing Kuwaiti ships leaving Kuwait. And the reason that they were bombing Kuwait was because Kuwait had become a kind of an outlet for Iraqi oil for the last 4 years. But also, Kuwait was considered to be the most major supporter of Iraq in its war against Iran financially. And so Iranians were deploying the same tactic that they're basically deploying this time around, which is to put the pressure on vulnerable points that are not necessarily the direct belligerents. So between 84 and 88, the 4 years until the end of the Iran-Iraq war, Iran and Iraq hit 400 and something ships. Lifting oil from one another. So I think 60% of the ships that were hit were tankers, and 60% of the ships, not the same 60, were hit by Iraq. So, but Iranians managed to really hurt, not necessarily Iraq, but Kuwait. And I think that was quite important, because then Kuwait in 86 came to both the US and Soviet Union and said, you need to flag our ships to your flag so that Iranians won't attack us.
So that they fall under their protection.
So that you fall under the protection. If you recall earlier, I mentioned how in the 19th centuries, you could fly a flag in order to claim protection from a larger power. And this is exactly what they were doing. And the US was really worried about Soviet Union coming in and having a role in the Gulf. And so they immediately agreed. And in effect, they became belligerents in the war because they basically were protecting Kuwaiti ships against Iran. And then they also started bombing Iran. So they bombed Kharg, they bombed a bunch of other oil terminals on shore. And in the summer of 1988, a US ship, USS Vincennes, fired a missile at an Iranian civilian airliner that was flying from Bandar Abbas to Dubai and killed 270 people, including 60 kids. And I think that it was that particular atrocity, but also a huge amount of negotiations that were happening at that point, which actually then brought Ayatollah Khomeini to the table. And they signed a ceasefire agreement with Iraq. And then over the course of the next few years, negotiated a settlement that has held thus far. It's interesting, though, because the fact that Iran had conceded in 1988, or at least Iranians felt that they had conceded in 1988, ended up becoming a really significant originary myth to Iran's sense of itself in the region. Khomeini agreed to that. He said, this is a poisoned chalice, and then promptly had a heart attack and died after the ceasefire. So it was really considered to be a kind of a major concession. But it seems to me that the tanker wars of 84 to 88 are really a harbinger of what the kinds of experiences we're seeing today.
I had a conversation with Professor Mehran Kamarava, and he was talking about how the Iran-Iraq war sets up this story for Iranians that not only, as you mentioned, that this was a poison chalice that we were forced to concede, but that this was a moment where Iran realizes that it's completely alone.
Yes.
In the region specifically.
With the exception of Syria. And I think that also explains in part why Iran stayed behind Syria through all of the sort of the revolutionary repression of the last decade. I think in a moment in which Iran was wholly alone in the region, Syria was the only country that stood by Iran. And I think that I think Iran felt like it owed a debt of gratitude to Syria. And I think that is also really interesting, is that in what we're seeing now is, of course, that the Israeli will to dominate the region, seems to have knocked everybody out of the game, with the exception of Iran. And I think this recent war was an attempt to knock Iran out as well. But we'll see where that goes.
I think we can bring our conversation to a close by talking about the elephant in the room, obviously. Recently, you wrote a paper where you talked about the idea of the life and death passages.
Yes.
And the way that different groups are now playing with maritime forces as places, whether that's the Gaza flotilla, for example, or the dock workers that are protesting against shipments to Israel, or then, of course, the Houthis pirating cargo vessels in the Mandeb Strait. What is, in your mind, has changed in the last few years with how these movements are taking place at sea?
So I think the state of maritime siege has been one of the biggest tactics of war forever. I mean, you even read about it in Herodotus. And then the sort of the attempt to break a siege by sea is also something that has happened in a number of different settings. But of course, the flotillas started, years ago, decades ago. In fact, from the moment that Israel placed Gaza under siege, we've seen flotillas that have attempted to break the siege. What has been interesting about the Ansar Allah closure of Bab al-Mandab and the Iranian closure of Hormuz is that what we're seeing for the first time is an asymmetric attempt to dominate these strategic straits. And it's asymmetric for a couple of different reasons. It's asymmetric because it is against the world's largest global military power, perhaps not just now, but historically. No other imperial power ever in history has expended as much on military as the US has, $1 trillion per year, or rising to $1.5 trillion next year, which is amazing amounts of money. But it's also asymmetric because it doesn't necessarily employ a military weapon to challenge superior military power. It uses commercial weapons, and the commercial weapons are deployed in very interesting sorts of ways. It is an awareness of the constraints of geography. So the fact, I think, that Ever Given managed to close the Suez Canal probably was a good lesson for the Ansar Allah in Yemen about Bab al-Mandab. And then the ability of Ansar Allah to put paid to the travel of shipping through the Red Sea was probably a good lesson for Iran. It was also asymmetric because in the face of massive warships, aircraft carriers, etc., both the Ansar Allah and the Iranians have used cheap drones, cheap mines, domestically manufactured cheapy missiles, most of which is both so inexpensive to produce that you don't care if they're lost, and so sort of partaking of a tactic of swarming targets that they're difficult to completely and totally knock out, and they can evade detection.
Because they're using their opponent's strength against them, which is
precisely
the U.S. is spending so much money on these very high-tech, very impressive interceptor missiles, which are incredibly hard to replenish, and they are swarming them and depleting them, and by extension, they're essentially saying, look how much money you are spending every single day trying to pursue this war.
One of these drones that Iran can deploy can at best be $20,000. Some of those missiles that the U.S. uses that are interceptor missiles can run up to millions. And so there is a complete asymmetry in this. But there's also another way that the both the Ansar Allah, the Houthis, and the Iranians have actually asymmetrically weaponized the character of the global trade against them, which is that they're both really cognizant of the role that insurance companies play. And the moment that the war risk premium goes up, it becomes much, much more expensive for ships to go through either Bab al-Mandab or through Hormuz Strait. And so all you have to do is pose a credible threat to shipping. War risk premium is going to go up, and Bob's your uncle. And so in a way, it was proven to be quite successful in the case of Bab al-Mandab. And so Iranians used it for Hormuz. But there is also another element in this, which I think Iranians have used, which the Houthis did not. And that is that the Iranians also targeted oil lifting terminals in third places. What Iranians are not doing is they're not attacking any oil facilities in Israel or the US, who were the direct and declared belligerents against Iran. They have attacked other facilities. So Ras Al Afan in Qatar, Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates. They've even lobbed a couple of missiles at the Yanbu lifting facility on the Red Sea, but also lots of ports and oil terminals in Kuwait and Abu Dhabi. And so there is definitely this element of putting pressure on vulnerabilities in the region has been one of the tactics that the Iranians have used. And of course, in both of those cases, both the Houthis in Bab al-Mandab and the Iranians in Hormuz, we have this element of harking back to past. The Houthis, ironically, descendant from the people that followed the Zaydi Imam, are now blocking or blocked the Suez Canal between 2023 and 2025, at a time when Egypt was actually aiding US's blockade. And then in Iran, you have the Iranians harking back to the tanker wars and in fact, using the same tactics then, which it did not use back then. It only threatened to do so. Using it now, it seems to be fairly effectively.
And that's what's really interesting about this moment is that, as you mentioned, Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz many times in the past.
Yeah.
And it's used it as a kind of theoretical deterrent.
Yeah.
But it's never actually done it.
Yeah.
And there was always a question of, is it even possible? Is it easy enough to? It's wider. It's less easy to control than the Suez Canal. It doesn't actually control all of its territorial waters itself. It shares that with Oman. What significance is there that Iran has taken this move now to not only try and punish the US, but to essentially put the entire global trade on hold as a result of this war?
So I think the points that you point out are absolutely relevant. Suez Canal is, it's just a few meters
It's an
wide.
artificial canal.
And it's an artificial canal. Bab al-Mandab is 13 nautical miles wide. The Strait of Hormuz is actually quite wide. And what's interesting about it is that, in fact, actually, you could probably sneak a ship out through there. The distance of Hormuz is divided between the sovereign waters of Iran and the sovereign waters of Oman, because Oman's Musandam Peninsula sits right on Hormuz. And so, if a ship wanted to go through the sovereign waters of Oman, it could potentially do so. If it turned off its automatic identification system, the digital identifier, if it was not visible for whatever reason in satellite imagery that Iranians could see, if it was not visible visually as Iranians could potentially see or their intelligence could see. And of course, they could go through as long as they didn't care if they got hit.
Yeah, by the sea mines, which may or may not be there.
By the missiles or by anything, because ultimately they do care, because, of course, if they get hit, it really, they may not be insured. And then what happens? And so I think the question of insurance and the centrality of the commercial mechanisms, the logic of risk, commercial risk, which is ostensibly completely non-military, has been really central to Iran's tactic here.
Because these gigantic tankers that you described before, they're also incredibly expensive.
They are. The ships are around $200 to $300 million. And then if they're carrying a cargo, however much it is. And then if their insurance has gone up to $7 million per day, they're not going to want to pay that. So they're not going to risk it.
Now that Iran has proved that it can do this move, is there any way for not just the region, not just the United States, but the whole world to really guarantee that this stretch of water that is so vital and that has always been free for navigation is really a stable place to do business?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of questions that are right now on the table. Obviously, Iran is not a signatory to the UN treaty that regulates the use of these waters. Actually, neither is the US. And so that's one of the questions that's on the table, is to what extent can Iran push and test the fact that it does have sovereign control over the Strait of Hormuz. The other elements that are on the table are to what extent can Iran push the use of tolls, for example, or assess fees for ships to go through there, or force bilateral negotiations, as India and Pakistan seem to have done through this whole thing, in order to get ships full of gas or oil to their countries. The other questions that are on the table are even bigger questions. To what extent are people going to be reliant on the US, whether for that umbrella of protection in the Gulf or for the US dollars as the sort of the fundamental basis of trade? Because one of the things that Iran did was to call for the payment of its fees in renminbis or in Chinese yuan, or in cryptocurrencies. And so it's a question also of to what extent can the US, which has used its domination of world's financial channels as a coercive mean, what is going to happen to that? There's a lot of questions open. What we're seeing is that Iran has been insistent on China being involved in the negotiations for whatever ceasefire there is. And we're seeing an unprecedented degree of involvement by all of the different countries in the region, including even the United Arab Emirates, in this process of treaty making, which I think is an attempt to guarantee the safety. Whether or not Iran will continue to try to assert its domination, I don't know. And so there's very little that I can predict in that sense, but they have certainly proven that they can weaponize, as I said, the global commercial risk logic in ways that allows them a degree of control over these sovereign waters. And
finally, Dr. Khalili, if the Suez Crisis was considered the nail in the coffin of the British Empire, Could the Hormuz crisis be seen going forward
as the U.S.'s Suez moment?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, ever since the U.S. decided to disastrously invade Iraq and cause the death and destruction of millions in the Middle East, people have sounded the death knell of the U.S. empire. The U.S. empire is multifaceted and incredibly powerful. What has been fascinating to me is the extent to which Trump has actually dismantled the hegemonic elements of U.S. empire, the soft power elements, which are not necessarily dependent on weaponry, but on goodwill, U.S. aid, and, as I said, the questions of soft power. And Trump has basically shot the U.S. not just in the foot, not just in the knee, but basically in the chin on that one. So the question is, really, will the U.S. survive the internal incompetence of its imperial managers? And that I'm really loath to predict, but I certainly can see that this has put into motion certain elements of the decline of the U.S. empire, which is going to be very hard to arrest.
Dr. Laleh Khalili, it's been an absolute pleasure. I have so many other things that I want to talk to you about, and we can be here for hours.
Inshallah, next time.
Inshallah.
All right.
Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.